Okay, so today I'm going to share with you why I think seaweeds are way cool. And by way cool, I mean very beautiful, very important to understand and appreciate, and ultimately to conserve. And I thought to do this, I would start off by telling you a little bit about how seaweeds have influenced and impacted and really enriched my life as a biodiversity researcher, as Nicole said. Okay, so as I said, I'm a biologist, and since about 2004, when I took my very first course in seaweeds at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, I've been basically in love with seaweeds. They are these beautiful, fascinating creatures to me, and after I finished my undergraduate at the University of Victoria, I went on to do my PhD at the University of New Brunswick. But I got to come back here every year to do my fieldwork collecting seaweeds. And my project took me to all kinds of really different and wonderful places around North America collecting seaweeds, including California, where I got to interact a lot with this guy. This is the sea palm postelsia. Some of you may have seen it. We have it here in British Columbia. I also got to go to Hawaii and do some scuba diving there, collecting seaweeds, which wasn't too bad. And places, even the subarctic, the kinds of places we don't normally think of as associating with seaweeds, but they are there as well, just not that many species. And I got to do some really cool things, like when I was in Churchill, Manitoba, these are belugas here in the background. We got to dive with these whales, which was pretty fascinating. And at one point we even had to abort a dive because this guy, this large male polar bear, was swimming over our dive site. So all these really wonderful things I got to experience because I was out collecting seaweeds as part of my research. So I thought, before I get into talking about what a seaweed is and isn't, I thought I would see how much you guys know about what seaweeds look like, how you can identify them. So if you guys have your clickers, we're going to try this out. So does everybody have a little clicker guy and it's all turned on? Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you, for this question, just take a look at these 4 pictures and decide for yourself how many of these pictures you think show you seaweeds. So go ahead and click in what you think the answer is.
I got seaweeds.
So 2 and 3. Okay, so who wants to volunteer what they think up here is not a seaweed? Which one is not a seaweed? Yes?
Eelgrass.
The eelgrass, yeah, that's a pretty obvious one. If you know anything about the diversity of the marine flora in British Columbia, you might recognize this guy. This is actually a land plant. It's not actually a seaweed. Okay. Well, the correct answer is 3. So these 3 guys, these are actually seaweeds. These are all different species of seaweed, including this one here, which may look very much unlike a seaweed, but that's because it's iridescing, which is something many red seaweeds can do. There's all kinds of weird and wonderful forms of seaweed out there in the world. Okay, so when I talk to people about seaweeds, what I normally hear from them is a negative association. People typically tell me that seaweeds are slimy, that they're gross, that they smell bad. And I think they have a bad rap, the seaweeds, because most people interact with seaweeds only when they're dead and washed up on the beach, which is what this photo is showing here. A big pile of dead seaweeds washed up on the shore. We don't typically, or the people I interact with a lot, don't typically think of seaweeds like this. And we certainly don't see them like this in their natural habitat when they're alive, when they're thriving in this intertidal zone here. We don't see them like this in popular culture much, except for maybe the kelp forests. But there are lots of other seaweed habitats out there and lots of other seaweeds besides kelps. I took this picture in California, but it closely represents the kind of diversity, the kind of intertidal you can see in many places around British Columbia as well. Has anyone ever been to a place that looks like this at very low tide? Okay, so a few people. Okay, so a few people have seen the seaweeds. I'm going to show you this slide again at the very end, and I challenge you to try to find out, identify how many different kinds of seaweed you can see in this picture, because there's actually, I'm not going to give it away, but there's more than one. And I'm going to talk about the biodiversity of seaweeds, and this word has many different meanings. I often see it in media and popular culture associated with places like this, the kind of tropical coral reefs, or maybe the rainforest in the Amazon. And the word biodiversity itself means several different things. You can study diversity at several different levels. I'm not going to get into that today. Suffice to say that when I'm talking about biodiversity, which is biological diversity compressed into one word, what I mean is the number of different species. So I'm talking about the number of different types of organisms out in the environment. And often when I hear about biodiversity in the media, in popular culture, it's about the loss, the destruction of habitats like the bleaching of a coral reef, and the loss or even extinction of species. And as humans, we tend to be quite concerned with the loss, especially when we think it's due to our own activities, and rightly so. The problem with measuring the loss of biodiversity, though, is if we have no idea how many species we had to begin with, it's really hard to tell when they're gone. And believe it or not, the reality is with many groups of organisms, we just have very little idea, very little accuracy or precision, an idea of just how many species there are. And that's what my research was centered around, finding out how many species there are of seaweeds, a certain group, how to tell them apart, and find out where they live. So just like with the other groups, the seaweeds, I would argue in particular, are a difficult group in that we don't really have an accurate idea of how many species there are, where we can find them, and how to tell them apart. So my goal today is to share with you my awe at the beauty and diversity of seaweeds that exists, if you're not already aware of this, and also my appreciation for the importance of seaweeds in coastal marine ecosystems in British Columbia and around the world, and also the influence that seaweeds have and have had on human lives from the ancient times right to the present, and the potential future uses of seaweeds by humans. For example, you may not be aware that British Columbia is actually considered a hotspot of seaweed biodiversity. We have lots of species here. So I'm going to tackle the diversity of seaweeds on 3 fronts. I'm going to talk about the diversity of forms, the different kinds of seaweeds we have, the diversity of the functions in the ecosystem, and the diversity of ways in which we humans make use of them. So this picture is showing you just a real spread of the different forms, colors, shapes, sizes that seaweeds take. They're really quite phenomenal in their different forms. And believe it or not, all of these different individual pictures here represent a different species of seaweed. So you might think, with all of this diversity of form and color and shape and size, what are the characteristics that these have in common? Why do we call them all seaweeds? Well, it turns out that seaweeds in general, the vast majority, share a number of characteristics. These include, they're all marine, with some exceptions. So we find these things in coastal marine ecosystems. They're multicellular, as my lab mate Katie is nicely demonstrating, this gigantic Palmaria palmata, or dulse. We found this in Grand Manan. So they're definitely multicellular. And they're attached to things, either to the substrate, to the rocks, buried in the sand, or to other organisms, like many actually will very happily attach themselves to anything, including other seaweeds. Some are even mobile, although they have a very unique way of getting around. Can anyone see what these red seaweeds are actually attached to?
A crab?
Yeah, it's a crab. Does anyone know what kind of crab it is? It's a decorator crab. So this is a species of crab that actually picks up organisms and sticks them to its back or all over its legs. And these seaweeds will very happily grow all over its back and very effectively camouflage the crab. I can't tell you how many times I've been scuba diving and collecting seaweeds, gone to reach for a specimen, and been startled when it either started running away or trying to pinch me. And these are all over British Columbia. We have them, this photo was taken in Victoria. And seaweeds are also photosynthetic. They're the primary producers in these coastal marine ecosystems, or they're part of the organisms that are the primary producers. So they make their own food, they capture the sunlight, and they photosynthesize. to produce their own food. There are some very cool exceptions to this, though. There are some seaweeds that are actually parasitic on other seaweeds, which is a really fascinating thing to study. Okay, so how many species of seaweeds are there? I'm going to get you guys to try to make a prediction of how many species you think exist out there in the world.
What do you mean by, sorry, what do you mean by parasitic when you said that before?
What do I mean by parasitic?
Parasitic on others.
Yeah, so there are some seaweed species that actually infect other species of seaweed and draw nutrients from them in order to grow. They no longer photosynthesize, they actually look white or reddish, or they may take on the color of their host. Okay. So we're going to use our clickers again. So this is getting you guys to interpret some data. So this is asking you the number of seaweed species out there compared to other types of life. And so each bar represents the approximate number of species that exist in 5 different groups out there in the world. These are species we know of that live today. So we're talking about mammals, birds, fishes, gymnosperm plants. These include things like conifers, so like pines and cypress trees and cedars, and also the seaweeds. So think about this for a second. Decide what you think is the bar that represents the number of seaweed species, and give me a nod when you've decided, and I'll open the voting. Okay, are you guys ready to vote? Okay. Go ahead and vote what you think. Oh, we have a real split. Most people think A, 31,000 species of seaweeds. Okay, so that's good. That's good to know. Wow, you guys think there's a lot. The actual answer is there's just under 10,000 species, accepted species of seaweeds globally. And what we're looking at is fishes in this particular category. Fishes are actually the most diverse group that I included here today. So that was nice. You guys think there's a lot more than there are. That's pretty cool. Maybe this will be a less exciting talk than I thought. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Well, what I can tell you is that within Canada, we have quite a few species. There's about 700 accepted species of seaweeds in Canada, about 600 of which we find along the coast of BC. There's only about 100 or so that we find along the Atlantic coast of Canada. So we have quite a few species here on our very own coast that you can go out and explore, although I recommend doing so during the summer low tides, because the tides are not very good at this time of year. But it's more than we have of birds or mammals or gymnosperm plants, so that's kind of cool. But how is all this diversity related to each other? How are these species all connected across and connected to each other and to other groups of life? I'm not going to get into it in great detail. It's a complicated story. Suffice to say that seaweeds are a little bit like the Mafia. You know how in Mafia movies, when they talk about a crime family, they're not talking about people who are all actually related by blood. They're actually people, there's some people who are related by blood. There might be brothers and fathers and sons and all that. But there are other people who are just part of the crime family. So they're defined, this crime family is defined based on the jobs these people are doing. They're all part of the Mafia. So it's more of a functional group than a group that's based on relatedness. And the seaweeds are a lot like that. There are 3 major groups of seaweeds that we talk about: the greens, the reds, and the browns. And maybe you guys already knew this, because this is kind of a commonly known thing, that there are greens, reds, and brown seaweeds. But within these groups, within the greens and the reds and the browns, all the species within those groups are closely related to each other, are relatively closely related to each other, are connected by descent. But between the groups, this is where we have more of a functional group. We group them all as seaweeds because they play the same roles in the environment, they live in the same sorts of places, they kind of look the same. So seaweeds are more of a functional group. For example, brown seaweeds, the kelps and their relatives, are more closely related to a group of phytoplankton called the diatoms, single-celled organisms, than they are to either of these 2 groups. And greens and reds, incidentally, are closely related to land plants. And there's quite a few species within these groups, although the reds are my favorite. This is what I studied. There's a heck of a lot more diversity in the red seaweeds around the world than there are in either the browns or the greens. Part of that has to do with the age of this group. the oldest known fossil of a red seaweed or red algae is about 1.2 billion years old. So it's a very old group. Incidentally, these groups are so named by their color, which is due to the pigments that they contain that they use for photosynthesizing, for capturing the energy of the sun. It's tricky, though, to apply this name all the time because reds especially, this is a beautiful red. This is one of the ones I studied. But other red seaweeds can look green. This one is actually iridescent as well. Or they can be almost black. So applying the name greens, reds, and browns is another kind of functional term for the group, as opposed to a solid name. So during my PhD, I got to come out here to British Columbia every summer, actually several times a year, and collect lots and lots and lots of different species and lots of different seaweeds. And my job was to try to find out how they were all connected to each other and how to tell them apart. Because believe it or not, we don't know how to do that for most seaweed species accurately. I just wanted to show you a bit of the diversity that I got to work with. This was 3 of the genera that were my favorites to study: Euthora, Bridgette, and Calophyllus, and just a few examples of plants that we collected while we were out here in British Columbia. So these are all species that you can go out and you can see, especially if you scuba dive. I also was lucky enough during my PhD to be able to help discover and describe 4 brand new species that had not been known before, including my absolute favorite, and the first one I ever described, was a species I named Euthora timbertonii in honor of, I know, it's kind of a funny name, that's the Latin version of Tim Burton's name. So this was a brand new species that we discovered in Banfield on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And new species of seaweed are found all the time, multiple times in a year. There's publications of new species, all kinds of new groups. But this one got a little bit of attention, I think, because of who it was named after. So it actually got on the Discovery Channel, and CBC did a story on it, so that was kind of fun.
Does he know?
Pardon me?
Does he know?
I sent him a letter, but he never responded. Actually, I sent him a copy of the paper I wrote, so maybe that's a bad reaction. Maybe it was really boring. But the take-home message here is that the diversity of seaweeds, the biodiversity, the number of species, we really have no real handle on this yet. There's new species being discovered all the time. So there's a lot left to find out there, even in a place like British Columbia, which is where a lot of the biodiversity research is actually done. There's still new species being discovered all the time. So next I wanted to move on into the different functions that seaweeds have. And I'm only going to talk... You're voting! I'm only going to talk about this for a couple of minutes because I think most people are fairly familiar with kelp forests or have heard of them before, and with the kinds of things that kelp forests and by extension other seaweeds do in the ecosystem. So a pretty obvious one is that seaweeds provide habitat for other organisms to live in, and this is very true. The coastal marine ecosystems are dominated by habitats provided by seaweeds, including not just along the bottom of the substrate for organisms to hide in, but also in the vertical column of the water. If the seaweeds weren't there, things like crabs and other invertebrates wouldn't have anywhere, they wouldn't be able to access this part of the water. So they're providing a whole three-dimensional structure for organisms to hide in, things like crabs, snails, sea stars, all kinds of different things. We often think about the habitat provided by kelp forests, but we don't often think about the habitat provided by the intertidal species, things like fucus. Has anyone ever seen fucus before on the beach? So a few people know. Fucus, if you've heard of rockweed before, that's a fucus. It's very common in BC, actually it's common almost all over the world, along the high intertidal, the part that's exposed most of the time to the air. And so this is a beach in Ireland that's just exposed for most of the day, and you see all the fucus, it's just dominating the landscape, and it's actually getting pretty dried out, but they're happy to get dried out. The habitat they provide, though, is for all the critters who are sitting underneath the seaweed, like these snails and other amphipods and fishes even, and sea stars, all kinds of different organisms, which would otherwise dry out or overheat or be found by predators if these seaweeds weren't here, flopped over for them to hide under. So they provide a tremendous amount of habitat for other things in the intertidal. They also, as primary producers, provide the oxygen, or a lot of the oxygen provided to coastal marine ecosystems, as well as, oh, you can see this here. This is an osmundia. This is a red seaweed. And you can see the little bubbles of oxygen it's producing as byproduct of photosynthesis. I think it looks a little bit like a little Christmas tree. And also, the seaweeds provide a huge food source to the herbivorous creatures that live in the coastal marine ecosystems. Things like the snails, the amphipods, the copepods, and herbivorous fish. So just to close on the functions, there's, just like we don't really know how much biodiversity is out there in terms of seaweeds, we also, as an extension of that, don't have a really good handle on all the different roles that seaweeds play out there in coastal marine ecosystems. So there's a lot left to discover in terms of what seaweeds are actually doing. And I didn't touch on a number of different habitats that are also dominated by different types of seaweeds. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the different uses that we humans have and have had for seaweeds since ancient times and right through to the modern present. So even though we don't fully understand yet the biodiversity of seaweeds and all the different roles they play, we sure do make use of this biodiversity in a whole bunch of different ways. Though the potential is there for us to be using seaweeds so much more than we already are. Oh, and the man here, this man here, this is Dr. Louis Droul. He's a very good friend and mentor of mine. He is a world-renowned expert in kelps and other brown seaweeds, who was for many years a professor at Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver. He now lives full-time in Bamfield on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where he and his wife run a very successful kelp farm, actually. So this is Louis and some students pulling up a line in which they've planted and then grown. Now they're harvesting a whole bunch of this one kind of kelp species. Does anyone have any idea what kind of kelp this is? Sugar-rack, yes, sugar-rack. So the name of this species, or the name of this kind of kelp, is Saccharina latissima, and Saccharina stands for, or represents the sugar that this seaweed has. It actually gives it kind of a sweetish taste, although in my opinion that's relative to other seaweeds. It's not actually that sweet. So probably one of the most obvious uses of seaweeds by humans is as food. And I'm curious to know, again using your clickers, what you guys think was the last time that you think you ate something with seaweed in it. So go ahead and vote if you know the answer. I think I know the answer. Oh, in the last 24 hours. Oh, and some of you think in the last week. Okay. Someone picked never. Someone always picks never. Okay, so what are some of the ways you guys ate seaweed in the last 24 hours for those of you who picked? Back in the blue? I couldn't hear you. In a package? In a package. Okay. Oh, as a snack. Okay, okay, good. So you had like actual seaweed.
Yeah.
In soup. What kind of soup?
Seaweed soup.
Seaweed soup. Okay.
Sushi.
You had some sushi. Okay, so yeah, here in Vancouver, we tend to eat more seaweed directly than some other places in Canada for sure. And even if you have a very traditionally Western diet, which does not make much direct use of seaweed unless you're in a place like Vancouver, you've probably eaten something with an extract of seaweed in it in the last week or so, I would say. So I was surprised to learn this when I first started studying about seaweeds, but humans have made use of seaweeds in a number of different ways, going back thousands of years. Some of the earliest written records of harvesting seaweed go back 2,000 years and are from China. But in other places as well, the harvest of seaweeds in Scotland, there's records of that going back at least 400 years. And we've actually been directly cultivating or farming seaweeds in many places for hundreds of years as well. So this, just to give you an example, here is this is a modern photo, but this is how Irish moss, or Chondrus crispus, was traditionally harvested along the eastern coast of Canada. This photo is from BC. So this is a natural harvest where they're just harvesting what naturally grows in the ocean. This is a photo from South Africa of a person harvesting a big load of kelp. And here's another photo of a direct cultivation. This is a farm in Zimbabwe where they're farming another species of brown seaweeds. Locally, there's also a number of uses. A number of the First Nations groups in BC have used seaweeds for generations. The Coast Salish, in particular, use seaweeds for a number of different things. They even use them for ropes when they were fishing, the big kelps. So there's kind of three main categories of use that we have for seaweeds. There's fodder, there's chemicals that we extract from seaweeds, and there's food. And fodder simply means food for livestock. So we feed seaweeds, or we have fed seaweeds in different cultures to livestock over the years. But I thought I would touch a little bit on chemical extracts. So it's something that's really cool about seaweeds is that in the three main groups, reds, browns, and greens, each group has its own unique structure, kind of compound in the cell walls that help give the seaweed its rigid yet flexible structure, which helps it survive the waves, the impact of waves. And we, for a long time now, have extracted these compounds from the cell walls for use as a gelling agent in all kinds of different things. And each group of seaweeds, the browns and the reds, not the greens, excuse me, have their own unique compounds that we extract for these purposes. The reds, for example, like this guy here, this is Gelidium. This is another type of seaweed that we find here in British Columbia. It's used commercially to harvest a kind of compound called agar, which is used very much in the research industry as a solid substrate for culturing microorganisms. From another group of red algae that includes Irish moss, here's Chondrus crispus again. There's another compound extracted called carrageenan, which is used for the same sorts of purposes, but we find carrageenan especially in a bunch of different foods, like on the table. Again, used as a thickener in things like toothpaste and chocolate milk. So if you had that in the last few days, I mean, you don't eat toothpaste, but if you've used it, then you've used something with seaweeds probably. And the browns have their own unique compounds that do the same purpose, and we also harvest as thickeners. So the browns have these compounds called alginates in their cell walls. And so here's a photo of the #1 species that's harvested for this purpose. It's called Saccharina japonica. We don't have it here in BC, but it is on the other side of the Pacific. It's harvested and processed to extract the alginate compounds from its cell walls, which you find on all kinds of weird things like salad dressings, for example, including a number of other industrial uses, like it's used in fertilizers and things like that. So one of the cool things I think about this, the uses of seaweeds, is that the compounds I just talked about are so complicated that we can't synthesize them on an economic scale. So we have to extract them if we want to use them from seaweeds. And they're taken from just a few different kinds of seaweeds that we find around the world. There's about a dozen or so types of seaweeds that are harvested on this commercial scale. So the potential for uses is huge of the seaweeds we don't explore yet. And part of that is connected to we don't know how to tell them apart, we don't know where they live. So there's so much yet to learn about seaweeds. I did want to touch on food. So what's a really common food that's found in Vancouver? That contains seaweed. Yeah, sushi, of course. So sushi, everybody probably has had sushi before, probably has sushi on a regular basis. I know I do. I moved here in the last year from New Brunswick, so I've gone from having no access to sushi unless I made it myself virtually, to now I have it all the time because it's everywhere and I love it. So just I would like you guys to volunteer and answer. Who can tell me which one of these is a sushi seaweed? We're not going to use the clickers for this one because I thought we wouldn't have time.
The green one?
The green one, okay, so the green one. Does anyone else have any other guesses? What do you think?
The brown one?
The brown one?
Yep.
This brown one or this brown one?
The top one.
This top one, okay. Anybody have any other guesses? Yes?
The one below the green one?
The one below the green one. This one here, this kind of purpley greenish one? Yeah, it could be. It looks kind of like a sheet of nori. Do you want to know which one it is?
Yeah.
It's the brown one. Well, it's actually a red. This is a red seaweed. And its new name is Pyropia. It actually just got changed in the last year from Porphyra to Pyropia. So if you were calling them Porphyra, you got to change the name just like me.
Why did they change it?
Oh, because they decided on a different arrangement of the relationship of the species have changed. Our understanding of their relationships have changed. So then you have to change the names around. That's part of what I got to do during my PhD. It's all very complicated when you have to change the name. But anyway, so Pyropia yezoensis is the #1 species that's farmed commercially for sushi, and it's a huge industry. It's worth about $2.5 billion annually, the harvest of Pyropia around the world. And it's harvested in farms, particularly in Asia, in places like China and Japan. The industries are particularly large. And then it's processed into these sheets that look kind of green that we call nori. And the cultivation of Pyropia has been going on for about 300 years. The first record of it is around Tokyo in Japan. But it wasn't until the 1940s that a seaweed biologist by the name of Kathleen Drew Baker actually uncovered the life history, so the life cycle of Pyropia. And it wasn't until we knew the life cycle of this type of seaweed that they could actually farm it commercially on a large scale. Before that, the farmers would just put ropes and shells out into the ocean and hope that the Pyropia grew there, that they could harvest. But now we can do it on this enormous scale because we know the life history of this organism. The very last human use I want to touch on is the one that's closest to my heart, is the aesthetic of seaweeds. The sheer beauty of these organisms that I find you can't see until you get close and actually look at the organisms themselves. And I find this particularly inspiring when I'm out in the intertidal looking at and trying to photograph and occasionally trying to draw these beautiful organisms. I'll just show you a couple of examples. I'm not the only one who thinks this. There have been many examples where people have been inspired to paint and draw and do all kinds of art because of the seaweeds that they see. They've even inspired various stamp collections around the world. I was really excited about this one because this contains Calophyllus, which is one of the things that I studied. I actually have a set of them up here if anybody's interested to see them. And also, seaweeds can be used. There's this new thing called designer sushi where you can actually buy these beautifully, intricately carved sheets of nori and roll these really beautiful rolls. So that's a way that seaweeds are used in art, not just inspiring art. And the very last example that touches closest to my heart. So I discovered that new species, Euthora timbertonii, and I shared that with my family and friends. And then it inspired my sister to make this painting, which I think is really quite beautiful, and my friend Kat, who made these very lovely muffins with seaweed-containing jello or fruit roll-up used to carve out the seaweed on top. So I feel like if you get inspired by the beauty of something you see in nature, that kind of spreads to the people around you, and I find that really wonderful and fascinating and just enriching to my life and to the people around me. And I just get so excited that this all comes from my home province, which is British Columbia. So I hope you guys take that away too, or I'm trying to share this with you, my love for them. So just to conclude, I just want to come back to that question of why. Why do I care about seaweeds, and why do I hope that you care about seaweeds too? And it really comes down to those three sort of types of diversity that I was talking about that the seaweeds have that you may not, until today, have been aware of. And I hope you agree with me at the end of this in thinking that seaweeds are these beautiful, amazing, and important organisms. So we just looked at the biodiversity, the different types of seaweeds, all the different forms that they have, the shapes, the sizes, all the functions they have in the ecosystem, and all the various ways in which we do use them, and the potential for all the new uses we could have in them if we study these organisms more. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So just before, I just wanted to make just a couple of acknowledgments. So most of the photos that I took, or I showed you today, if I didn't take them myself, they came from this wonderful online repository of seaweed information called AlgaeBase. If you ever want to look at photos, read papers, learn more about seaweeds, algaebase.org is the place to go. For general information, seaweeds.ie is the place to go for all the different uses and all kinds of stuff like that. So if you're interested in learning more about seaweeds, these are the places to go.